Today, we begin a new sermon series. We are going to follow for the next 5 weeks through the month of September. We're going to follow the lectionary passages from the book of James. I don't know how many of you ever read the book of James. It's a shorter book towards the back of the New Testament, but really an informative book on what the Christian life should look like. James, we're calling this series Faith That Works, because James emphasizes that if you were to be a faithful person, to live a life of righteousness as we heard this morning, then there is some outward expression of that must manifest itself in your life. In other words, you can't just claim the label of Christian and not let your life reflect what that should look like. James emphasizes this. Interestingly, Martin Luther hated the book of James. The great theologian Martin Luther, he didn't like the book of James. He said that James contradicted everything that Paul tried to tell us about how we are saved through grace alone and not our good works. John Wesley, interestingly enough, actually loved the book of James. Because Wesley said, look, you're saved through grace, yes, but that ongoing grace in your life produces fruit. It produces outward expression. In other words, you can be saved through grace and claim it, but if your life, if you're not loving, serving, being generous, kind, merciful, if you're not doing those things, then Wesley would say you weren't actually saved in the first place. To be saved is this holistic thing that through grace and through the transformation of our life, we reflect God's love. And so we're going to spend the next 5 weeks looking at how, I put it this way, looking at how our faith should have hands and feet, how we should put this into practice in our life. We began early in James's letter this morning, and it's almost like first reading, it's almost like, getting somebody wagging their finger at you, don't be angry. I love that phrase in this translation, rid yourself of moral filth. What a great phrase, moral filth, whatever that is. And it's like this condemnation, don't do this, don't do that. Sort of how we think of the Ten Commandments sometimes, thou shalt not, thou shalt not. And it's like, does that really motivate? As religious people, we forget the fact that fear and guilt and condemnation, that doesn't motivate anyone to change their life. Too often we think it does, but I think studies are now showing that the decline in religious participation, people not going to church as much, people not being as active in their faith as much, a lot of that has to do with the fact that we get it wrong. We think that we can scare you into changing your life or guilt you into changing your life, wag our finger at you long enough until you change your life. Is that what James is saying to us this morning? I read the passage over and over this week and just trying to get the tone of the letter. And it occurred to me that I jumped to that little, about 4 verses in, the whole don't do this, don't do this, don't do this. And I forget the very beginning of the passage. Every good and perfect gift comes from God. You are born of God. Your life is a gift from God. James begins, there's not finger wagging, but it's a reminder that we are first and foremost God's. Everything you have is a gift. No matter how much we think we pull ourselves up by these imaginary bootstraps, or no matter how much we think that we're the author and captain of our own life, no matter how self-sufficient we think we are, we forget the fact there's nothing you have that doesn't come from God. Every good gift comes from God. You are one of those gifts from God, born of God. We hear this teaching, and maybe we hear those, don't do this, don't do this. Maybe we hear it in a different way. Maybe those admonitions from James, maybe it's not finger wagging so much as saying, you were made for a fulfilling life, rich in grace and mercy. Now here's how you do it. Don't do this, but do this. Don't get angry, but listen more. That jumped out at me this week, and I don't know why, but it just feels like anger is like the go-to emotion for us these days. You turn on television, cable news, read the newspaper, go on the internet, whatever you want to do. It's like everything's fueled by this anger. And we don't listen, do we? But James says, look, you want to live a life rich and full of God's grace? Listen, don't be so quick to put your 2 cents in. Have humility. Don't be so quick to get angry with everything. This is the way of life. It's not guilting you, it's pointing you to a better way. So how do we respond to this teaching? If it's not about being guilted into life transformation, how do we get to this transformation of our life? And I think James tells us it's simple yet profound. One commentator put it this way. He said that righteous living, I'm paraphrasing, righteous living is not about rigid obligation. It's about living a life in gratitude to God, responding to God's grace with gratitude. Living a faithful life isn't about being told to go to church all the time. It's not about being told to study the Bible. It's not, you don't do it because, well, your parents raised you in the church, so you got to do it now for your parents' sake. Or you got to do it for the church because you told us that you would support the church, so we're going to guilt you into supporting the church. It's not about any of that. You come here, and then you go out and live a life of faith as a grateful response to the God who loves you so much. James reminds us that gratitude is a much better motivator than fear and condemnation and obligation. To be grateful is how we're supposed to live. And everything we do, all the righteous living we do, comes out of this deep sense of gratitude. Think about it for just a minute. I mean, I want you just to let it sink in. You are one of God's gifts. Do you hear that? You were made in the image of a God who loves you more than you could ever imagine. Do you hear that? Sit with that for a moment. There's nothing in your life that can keep you from the love of God. Nothing. You are a beautiful child of God. Sit with that. There's this image that James uses that I love. Do you hear the image of a mirror? You know, the difference between being a hearer and a doer of the word. A hearer is someone who goes and looks in the mirror, and then when they walk away, they forget what they look like. Interesting image there. I think so often we go to the mirror and look to the mirror of our souls, and maybe we don't always like what we see. Mistakes and shortcomings and brokenness. So maybe we don't even bother looking in the mirror sometimes. We don't want to see that. And what we fail to see is that underneath all that stuff we don't like is something that grounds us, that's much deeper and grander and more powerful than any of the negativity, any of the baggage. And that is the presence of God, born inside of each of you. It lives there. It dwells in you. This presence that loves you at a level that you could never imagine. James says to be a doer of the word is to look in the mirror and see that. Not the baggage, but the beauty. And then to go and live that out. Not forgetting whose we are, right? And we look in the mirror, we see God. The presence of God. And then we go live like it's true. That is to put your faith into action in your life. One of my favorite stories to think about how to see God in us, one of my favorite stories is told by Dr. Fred Craddock, the great teacher of preachers. Craddock tells the story that he was on vacation once with his wife, and an old fella comes up to him in the restaurant where they're eating and just strikes up a conversation. And he, Craddock's being gracious and talking, but he's on vacation. I mean, you know how that is. You don't want to just talk to strangers all the time. And the guy asks Craddock, he says, "What do you do for a living?" And Craddock says, "Well, I'm a preacher." To which the guy grabs a seat, invites himself to sit down at Craddock's table, and he says, "You're a preacher. I've got a story for you." Now, side note here, I'm your preacher. I love you, okay? But when I'm on vacation, I'm just going to be honest with you, there's a preacher's wife sitting down here. You don't want to be in preacher mode on vacation. Craddock begrudgingly, okay, all right, got a story for the preacher, let's hear it. The old man tells him this story. He says, when I was born, I didn't have a father. My mom didn't know who my father was, and I grew up not having a father. This was like the 1930s or 20s or some long time ago. Small southern town, and you can imagine the stigma that a child carries whenever everyone in town knows that there's a daddy somewhere, but we don't know who it is. He said the boys used to pick on me on the playground, call me names. You can imagine what name they used. I won't repeat it, but you could fill in the blank. And he said I would keep to myself a lot because I dreaded being picked on. It was just the worst thing ever, and he just carried this stigma with him. A new preacher came to town, he said, and back in those days, that was exciting news, and so everyone goes and checks out who the new preacher is at least once to hear him, right? So the boy goes into church, hear the new preacher, and he likes what he hears, and he says, I just started going more and more. But what he would do was he was so afraid of being picked on, he would arrive to church late, and he'd sneak out early so he could avoid people, right? Well, one Sunday he got so caught up in what the preacher was saying that he forgot to leave early. And so the last hymn goes, and everyone's starting to leave, and he's trying to make a mad dash to get out of the sanctuary. And the old man said that here he is as a boy. All of a sudden he felt this strong hand on his shoulder, grabbed him. He turns around, and it's the preacher. And the preacher says, "Boy, who do you belong to? What's your name? Who's your daddy?" And you can imagine. The boy, here's the one thing, the one fear he's got. He's just, oh God, dreading it. Now here's the embarrassment all over again. But he said the preacher paused and looked at him real closely. He says, "Wait a minute. I know who you are. You're the child of God. I see a striking resemblance," he said. "Now go, boy, and claim your inheritance." Craddock said the old man got up from the table and he said, those words that day changed my life forever. Whatever we carry in our lives that we don't like to look in the mirror about, there is something deeper and more beautiful. There is the presence of God in you. Now, what we do with that, we'll talk about and unfold over the next 5 weeks. But I want you today to go home and to look in the mirror. Spend some time. Some of us avoid the mirror on purpose, but I mean it. Spend some time. Look at what you see there. Do you see all that brokenness and ugliness and things that you just don't want to think about? Or do you see what's really there? And that is the face of a beautiful child of God, made in love, made for love. And when you see that, I hope a profound sense of gratitude comes over you. And out of that gratitude, a life of action, of love, of mercy, and grace. Amen. Hey, thanks for watching the latest sermon here at Historic Trinity Church in Savannah, Georgia. I'm Reverend Ben Gosden. I'm the senior pastor here at Trinity Church. And I want to take this opportunity to invite you. If you're ever in Savannah, Georgia, we would love for you to visit us on Sunday morning at 11 o'clock. We're located on Telfair Square, been here since 1848. Also, you can check out the comments below for a way to give if you feel so led. Again, you're welcome anytime here at Trinity Church.